once you mute, I think we have to ask you to unmute. So I just did that in case you wanted to talk.
Okay.
Yeah. But I think Joshua took it off now, so should be fine.
Which one is that, Kimberly?
Yeah, I'm able to unmute now. You'll indicate before you go live, before you start, right?
Yeah, we'll let you know.
Okay.
We're going to admit the persons, right, from the meeting room.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. We'll just give the attendees 2 more minutes and then we'll begin. Okay, it is 1:05, so we can begin our session today. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kimberly Badlu, and I'm a standards officer from the Standardization Division of TTBS, where I've worked for 10 years. I'd like to welcome you all to our session today for the draft standard for the refrigeration and air conditioning sector. I would also like to acknowledge and welcome our committee members present today. Our opening remarks will be delivered by the manager of the Standardization Division, Ms. Nadita Ramachala. So Ms. Ramachala is the manager of the Standardization Division of the TTBS, with over 15 years experience in the development of Trinidad and Tobago standards, mainly in the area of electrical engineering. Ms. Ramachala was responsible for the formulation of a number of standards in the electrical field, including lighting products, electrical cables, appliances, and the National Wiring Code, as well as renewable energy systems. She holds a BSc in Electrical and Computer Engineering from UE, as well as an MSc in Project Management and a Master of Business Administration. It's my pleasure to turn you over to Nadita.
Thank you, Kimberly. So good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the TTBS's Board of Directors and Management, I'm pleased to welcome all the participants to our stakeholder consultation on the draft voluntary standard for the refrigeration and air conditioning sector. This standard was developed with the overall objective of improving the general quality in the refrigeration and air conditioning sector in Trinidad and Tobago, and to support all organizations, agencies, and individuals responsible for refrigeration and air conditioning systems by providing minimum requirements for operations. The purpose of this consultation is to get your feedback, and we really appreciate you spending your time here with us to give feedback. Okay, so I will pause. Kimberly, can you confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, Nadita, I can hear you. You can go ahead.
Okay, so I'm seeing some messages that persons cannot hear, but I will continue. The purpose of this consultation is to highlight the requirements of the draft voluntary standard and to solicit your feedback with the aim of finalizing the draft standard. TTBS is pleased to collaborate with the Ministry of Planning and Development in the development of this particular standards project. And I would like to acknowledge Dr. Marissa Gowrie, National Ozone Officer from the Ministry of Planning and Development. She has been a champion of the implementation of the Montreal Protocol nationally, regionally, and internationally. We've had a long and successful collaboration with the National Ozone Unit at the Ministry of Planning and Development. So at this point, I'd like to express my gratitude to all the presenters at today's session, Dr. Gowrie, Mr. McBurnett, representing the Air Conditioning and Refrigeration Industry Association, as well as Mr. Hadai, who was the Technical Secretary of the Specification Committee that developed the draft standard covering general requirements for the REC sector. I'd also like to thank Ms. Kimberly Badlu, who is Standards Officer in the Standardization Division, for moderating today's session. So as you all should be aware, TTBS has been very active in the development of standards for the REC sector with the publication of the following standards. We have a voluntary standard for energy efficiency of air conditioners. This is TTS/CRS 59/2021, which was based on a CARICOM regional standard. A voluntary standard for energy efficiency labeling of refrigerating appliances, and this is TTS/CRS 57/2021, which was also based on a CARICOM regional standard. Both these voluntary standards are being upgraded to compulsory standards this year. Therefore, we encourage you to participate in the stakeholder consultation for these standards projects later on, as it is very important to provide feedback as these standards are compulsory. This means that they will be actively enforced by TTBS via the implementation division of TTBS. We also have TTS 76 Part 20, 2015, which is a compulsory standard that provides labeling requirements for refrigerant containers. This standard is one that is actively enforced by TTBS, and you may be very familiar with Ms. Carla Smith from our implementation division. In addition, we have the national adoption of the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code, and this is a voluntary standard that we are finalizing at this present time. It is a critical standard which can be used in the design and construction of buildings. Air conditioning systems typically consume significant energy in buildings, and according to a 2020 journal article on improving energy efficiency of HVAC systems in buildings, a review of best practices, HVAC systems account for approximately half of all energy usage in the operational phase of a building's life cycle. This brings to bear the importance of a standard such as the one that we are here to discuss today. The proposed standards are intended to support the implementation of the Montreal Protocol and provide best practices to the industry so that we can ensure that the sector operates safely, considers the environmental impacts, and follows best practices for energy efficiency where practicable, in conjunction with the other standards that I have highlighted previously. Competence of practitioners is a critical aspect of ensuring health, safety, and environmental performance in the REC sector. Therefore, the standard can serve as a resource document for the development of technicians in accordance with best practices. Therefore, I encourage all participants to critically review the draft standard. We urge all participants to raise any concerns to help us ensure that the final standard is practicable and applicable in your operations and businesses. In conclusion, I once again extend a special welcome to all the participants today. Your presence emphasizes the fact that all participants and their nominating organizations, where applicable, continue to play a critical role in the development of national standards and the creation of a standards-conscious society. I wish you all a productive and informative session. Thank you, and I look forward to a very engaging session. I will now turn you back to our moderator, Ms. Badlu.
Thank you very much, Nadita, for that indeed warm welcome. So we'll move straight on into the agenda, which states that I am next. So let me just share my screen. Can everyone please confirm that you see in my screen? Okay. Are you seeing the slideshow now, or is it still in slideshow mode?
Slideshow.
Okay, great. Good. Okay, so thank you, everyone. As I said previously, my name is Kimberly Badlu, and I'm from the Standardization Division. So most of you here may be familiar with TTBS and its operations. So I will do a quick recap into the standardization process and the key aspects of TTBS's mandate. TTBS has several roles and responsibilities under the Standards Act, number 18 of 1997. We are the national standards body, as well as the national quality certifying body, with responsibility as well for the national lab accreditation body. And under the Metrology Act of number 18 of 2004, we are also the National Measurement Institute. Two key documents I would love to highlight would be the NQP, which outlines our responsibilities for our national quality infrastructure, as well as the NSS, the National Standardization Strategy, which outlines our 3-year work program with respect to standards development. TTBS has the vision of being the essential provider for national quality solutions, leading to a standards-conscious society that is also globally competitive. And to support this, we are responsible to champion the development and implementation of standards, measurement systems, and conformity assessment services for competitiveness and sustainability of TNT. So this is our standards-related mandate of TTBS. The Bureau shall promote and encourage the development and maintenance of standards, and further shall establish standards for the improvement of goods produced or used in Trinidad and Tobago, to ensure industrial efficiency and development, and to promote public and industrial welfare, health and safety, and obviously for protection of the environment, which is a main reason why we are here today. What is a standard? So let me simply explain, although I'm sure everyone here is familiar with what a standard is. This is a technical document that provides an agreed upon, repeatable way of doing something. Standards provide a commonly accepted and repeatable way of defining the objective technical requirements of products. And when used efficiently, standards can foster trade, protect public health and safety, preserve the environment, and also promote innovation. So why standards? Standards are a big part of our lives. Anything grown, produced, traded is subject to standards. The computer you're using is subject to standards. The phone you're texting on, subject to standards. And if your phone is faulty, then the standard is probably not made to a standard. So that's why standards are very important. And at TTBS, we have two types of standards. We have voluntary standards, which represent the minimum levels of acceptability for a product or service. It's adopted at the discretion of a building. However, when it is adopted, it has to be adhered to in its full aspect. It is market-driven, and it also can be incorporated into the regulatory schemes of other state agencies. For example, the Electrical Wiring Code is a great example of this. It's a voluntary code, which is made compulsory through the legislation of the GEI, the Government Electrical Inspectorate. And we also have compulsory standards, also called conformity assessment documents. And this is where quality can impact the health and safety of users or the environment. And then requirements are legally enforceable by TTBS via our implementation division. And compulsory status is conferred by the Minister of Trade and Industry. So let me move into the standards development process. So as previously mentioned, we have an NSS, our National Standardization Strategy. And there we have the standards that we will cover for the next 3 years. And once a standard is identified there, we have to do our technical and market research and come up with a working draft document, which is our 3rd step. Our 4th step, it requires the comprisation of a specification committee, which works on these standards. And this committee can comprise members of the manufacturing, it can use tertiary education or any sort of academia. And we also have various members of ministries. And then this standard, after it's been crafted and carefully selected and carefully created, it goes out for public comment, which is where we are today. So our standard has been modified and created by our technical experts. And now you are given the opportunity to give your comments on the standard. You can tell us what you think about the standard, whether you think it's too harsh, whether you think it's not harsh enough, whether you think we need more regulations or explanations here and there. So this is your opportunity to be on our spec committee and give us your input at this stage. The next stage, our public comment, I believe, finishes on the 5th of May. So you have until the 5th of May to submit your comments. And after that, we will be resolving those comments. We will go through each one, every single comment, and we will choose to either accept or maintain what is in the current standard. And I believe we will also post that on our TTBS website. So you can keep track of your comments and the status of your comments. Then it goes to our Technical and Marketing Committee, which is a subcommittee of the Board of TTBS. And once it's approved there, it goes to the Board of Directors. And finally, it's published as a national standard. So our national standardization strategy, as I would have mentioned, is a prioritized list of standards to be developed over a 3-year period. And this document is available on our website. So I strongly encourage you to go and have a look. It would have been done for the period of 2019 to 2022. So we will be doing an updated version for the next 3 years. So I'd like to mention that it was based on the ISO methodology using statistical data for TNT for sectors contributing to our GDP and export potential, incorporating issues with significant impact, social impact, and government initiatives. So you can always take a look at this on our website. And when we are redoing or revising, I should say, for the next 3 years, your input would be very vital and imperative to help us create a document that will assess and address all of the needs of our society today. So if you have any thoughts or any standards that is needed for your sector, you can email us and let us know. So there's a lot of emphasis on the UN sustainable goals with respect to the emerging areas of standardization. We have a lot of standards related to sustainability, governance of organizations, climate change, circular economy, e-commerce, smart cities, and sustainable building materials. So a lot of standards related to these things are on the horizon. And if you'd like to contact us, as I previously indicated, you can email us at ttbspubliccomment@ttbs.org.tt, or you can call us at extension 2042-662-TTBS. And we'll be happy to address any of your needs, to take any considerations you have for our NSS and anything else that you may like to speak about. You can contact us. Are there any questions? Well, any questions I believe we'll address at the end. But if you have any vital questions, we could probably go through it now. Okay, so we'll move straight into our next presentation according to our agenda. Let me just take off my screen. Okay, so our next presentation will be done by Dr. Marissa Gowrie, who will be highlighting the importance of the standard for the RAC sector. So Dr. Gowrie has been in the environmental field for the last 23 years. She does not look it. She is a graduate of the St. Augustine Girls High School and from then the University of the West Indies with a PhD in environmental biology. She holds the portfolio of Deputy Environmental Manager in the Environmental Policy and Planning Division under the Ministry of Planning and Development, in addition to being the National Ozone Officer for the past 20 years. Among her other environmental activities, she has overseen the successful implementation to date of this country's national obligation under the Montreal Protocol, which involves the phase-out of ozone-depleting substances. She has been internationally recognized for her work in this field, and in 2017 was the recipient of one of 15 international individual awards for implementation, from the UN Environment Program, Policy and Implementation of the Montreal Protocol. She was also elected to be one of the 3 vice presidents position of the Bureau of Montreal Protocol for 2022. So I turn you over into the more than capable hands of Dr. Gori.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. Just confirming that you can all hear me well.
I can hear you very well.
Okay, fantastic. So good afternoon, everyone. And I am so happy to be here today. I think that this is a very significant point for us as a country, as a sector, in implementation of both the Montreal Protocol and in terms of progression of the refrigeration and air conditioning sector that I have very happily been a part of for, as Kimberly said, the last 20 years thereabout in my capacity as National Ozone Officer. And I would have liaised with many of you on the call here today. And, I always like to take these opportunities to express my thanks to all of those in the sector who have been so supportive to the work of the National Ozone Unit and the Montreal Protocol over the years. And really, as the Ozone Office and the Ozone Unit, our role and function is to help support the sector to ensure that what you guys are doing are in alignment with the Montreal Protocol and that you are skilled and tooled to be able to be as professional as you can in the work that you do and able to adapt to all these changes, as you know, that's happening in your sector for the last almost 3 decades now. I also want to start off by taking the opportunity to express my very, very deep thanks to the TTBS, who has been a very vital stakeholder in our national implementation and who does extremely good work in terms of implementation of our standards, our border control, and just ensuring that what we get here in the country up to a certain level of standards so that we are not compromised in our job and our servicing of these very important units that we implement in the country. As we all know, refrigeration and air conditioning underpins so many aspects of everything we do. So, we always have to make sure that what we get into the country is up to par. So I don't want to be extremely long, but I do want to, start off by giving a little bit of context to how we got here today. And for those of you who may have been at the recent engagement we would have had with the importer, some of these slides would look familiar. I just pulled out a few that I think might be pertinent to our discussion today. So forgive me if the information looks a little bit similar to what we would have presented about 2 weeks ago. Yeah, I do not know why my slides are not moving. Okay, there we go. Right. So basically, I will just start off by saying what I think most of you here would already be familiar with, which is that Trinidad and Tobago would have signed on to the Montreal Protocol in 1989. And essentially, this is a global agreement that was put into place in the 1980s when threat to the ozone layer was discovered, the ozone layer being this very thin shield that surrounds the Earth that filters UV rays from the sun and without which life on Earth exists as we know it. If we get UV rays directly towards us, it can cause things like skin cancer, eye cataracts, weaken our immune system, affect agricultural yield, etc. So being a party to the Montreal Protocol, we have to put in place actions to ensure our national obligations are adhered to. And that addresses chemicals that are ozone depleting. We call them ozone depleting substances, most of which are found in the refrigeration and air conditioning sector. And those in the sector would remember the CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons way back when, HCFCs, these are ozone depleting substances. We are currently phasing out HCFCs. We would have phased out CFCs at the end of 2007. We started our HCFC phase out in 2013, and we've been doing that now. And there are other chemicals that are also damaging, such as methyl bromide, which is a fumigant, halon in the fire suppression sector, action on which have been taken as well. And work has been going on to ensure that these other chemicals are addressed. One of the things that is very pertinent right now is that one of the chemicals that we were told to use as an alternative chemical to these ozone depleting gases in the refrigeration sector, which you all in the sector know as HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, that has been found to contribute to climate change, even though it doesn't affect the ozone. And therefore, the Montreal Protocol would have taken a decision to add these chemicals onto the basket of gases that we control or we address in terms of our phase out and phase down activities. And therefore, that gas, HFCs, those gases, blends of them, etc., will be addressed from 2024, which is in just a few months, and that we will be taking action as a country to phase down these gases and move towards gases that are both ozone and climate friendly. In terms of how this is all administered in the country, we have a licensing system that is administered by the Ministry of Trade and the Trade Licensing Unit, another vital stakeholder to our work. And again, thank you so much to them for their vigilance in what they do. We also have a quota system that's attached to gases that we are phasing out. So we would have had a quota system for CFCs, and that's completed now. So that's no longer allowed into the country. We will have a quota system currently in place for HCFCs, and we will be putting a quota system in place for HFC gases come 2024. So that's something that is going to be happening very, very soon. And a lot of work is currently going on to ensure that we are in a good place to start our phase down of the HFCs. Other agencies we work very closely with, as I mentioned, the Trade Licensing Unit, as well as the Pesticides and Toxic Chemicals Inspectorate. So these are some of the government entities that basically control the substances that come into the country. I mentioned the ozone depleting substances are controlled by the licensing system, both on the import and export negative list. We require a license for all refrigerants, all equipment and parts for anything related to refrigeration and air conditioning for both import and export. There were several revisions that were done to these lists, and one was done in 2014 to include blends of HCFCs, and one was most recently done in 2022 to include all the HFC gases under the Kigali Amendment. So Nadita would have mentioned some of these standards already, and again, we are very grateful to the good work that TTBS has done over the years, both in the development of these standards as well as the implementation of them. We are very much looking forward to the minimum energy performance standards that are going to become compulsory fairly soon, as well as this refrigeration code that is something that is so crucial to, providing that level of structure that has been requested of us from you, the sector, for many, many years. Over the years, as the National Ozone Unit, we have been approached by the sector in terms of, some inconsistencies that exist in the level and types of servicing. There's a plethora of refrigerant out on the market now. Those in the sector long enough would know that we went from probably gases we could count on one or two hands to now, tons and tons of gases. So in terms of ensuring that technicians out there know what they're doing, that customers get proper service, these pieces of equipment are not cheap, so that you need to ensure that, who's manipulating the equipment, they know what they're doing, as well as some of these gases also have a flammability component. So there's the safety aspect as well. And we want to ensure that the sector is placed in a good position to integrate all of these things onto our local market. I mentioned the Pesticides and Toxic Chemicals Inspectorate. Under their legislative framework is where we also control the HFCs, and for certain quantities you do require premises license, etc. That was put into full effect in 2021, January 1st. The Pesticides and Toxic Chemicals Inspectorate has also been working very closely with us over the years in terms of the phasing out of methyl bromide, because as a fumigant, they have direct control over that as a toxic chemical. So a lot of gratitude is also expressed to them for their excellent work over the years. So just in terms of giving you a little, update of the phasing out of the HCFCs, we have started, as I mentioned, the phase out in 2013. I should note when I said that we were doing the CFCs and we had that phase out, we're doing the HCFCs, there was also controls placed on import of equipment, so that we had stopped CFC equipment coming into the country in 1999. We also stopped HCFC assembled units coming into the country from 2015. And this greatly helped the transition of the market away from the gases that we don't want towards the gases that are more environmentally friendly. So as we have been moving along, we have been, coming down in terms of our consumption of the HCFCs. And this gives you just it in a bit of numbers. Our baseline, and what the baseline is all about, is that we are mandated by the Montreal Protocol to freeze at a national baseline at a certain year, and then come down or phase down. So for the CFCs, we would have started our baseline at 122 metric tons and phased down all the way to phased out all the way to zero. For the HCFCs, we would have frozen in 2013 at 838.9 metric tons. And we have been phasing out as we go along. We are actually down to 80.82% reduction from our baseline, which is excellent. So this has been achieved by some of these activities that's listed there on the slide. in terms of, training, awareness, provision of equipment, testing of refrigerants. And TTBS has an accredited lab where we do refrigerant testing. They also test all of the equipment, the gases, coming in. And they also monitor the equipment coming in terms of labeling in accordance with the standards that we mentioned before. We would have developed a national cooling strategy for the country that will guide, it's like our roadmap if you want to look at it like that as we move forward. And also wanted to note that we also would have had developed a national guidelines for the refrigeration and air conditioning sector. The cooling strategy and the guidelines were done through a similar consultative process. We would have gone around in the sector, gotten feedback. I just want to highlight the national guidelines in particular. So the national guidelines was actually framed against a UN document for guidelines for parties under the Montreal Protocol. We would have used that as the base and gone out for consultations widely, both in Trinidad and Tobago, gotten a lot of feedback. It would have gone for cabinet to get approval, which it did. So that's a cabinet approved guideline. And the reason I want to highlight that is because that guideline was used as the base for the development of this refrigerant code. So the content of this code is very much aligned or same as the guidelines. And there were some additions that were placed into the code because now we have to deal with flammable refrigerant. We were looking at a little bit more detail in terms of the different types of refrigerant that were there and servicing practices, etc. So I just wanted to highlight that the guidelines really formed the framework against which this code was developed. I mentioned Kigali, so we are now moving towards our implementation of Kigali. We are currently doing our survey where we'll be gathering information. For the last 2 times, CFCs and HCFCs, how the baseline was determined was through surveys, just like what we're doing now. And then the way it's done is when we have our baseline, the baseline would be apportioned to the historical importers. And those would be the importers that would be allowed to import moving forward. So no new importers. New importers would be encouraged to bring in the gases that we want to move toward. But in terms of the ones we wanted to get rid of or phase out or phase down, the historical importers who would have contributed to that baseline for the periods, the years that we were looking at, they would be apportioned a quota, and then we cut back going forward. So this basically is just a schematic that shows you a little bit of a timeline of where we will be going and some of the targets we have to hit. The baseline for what we call the KIP, which is the Kigali Implementation Plan, for the years 2020, 21, and 22. So we are currently assimilating our 2022 data, which every year we report to the Montreal Protocol on our imports. And we are currently doing our surveying, both top down and bottom up. So we are coming out to the various companies and importers, getting a sense of exactly what is out there so we can properly represent the country. And then we would have to take action going forward from 2024. If you look at the diagram, it also shows you quite a number of refrigerant that we're dealing with now in terms of the different HFCs, the blends. We also have things coming onto the market, HFOs. We have CO2 as a refrigerant, hydrocarbon. So there are tons of refrigerant out there, and hence the extreme need for the sector to have that framework support, such as like this code, to help guide the sector in moving forward. This is just an example of all the gases that's listed under Kigali. So this would be these gases and any blends thereof. And these would have been the gases that were added to the import-export negative list in 2022. So as I mentioned, we'll be freezing at our baseline in 2024, where we'll be starting our quota system for HFCs. And then action will be taken, as we did in the previous rounds with the CFCs and HCFCs. We will be undergoing certain procedures to put action in place so that we can transition the market in terms of equipment coming into the country towards ones that use refrigerants that are more ozone and more climate friendly. Yeah. I think I mentioned this before. The survey is, I can't underpin how much the survey is crucial for us to get a good baseline, an accurate baseline, so that as a country, we're not put in any, position that we don't want to be in moving forward in our HFC implementation. I want to thank very much the members of the specification committee that would have worked very hard in developing this particular code. I was quite impressed by the fact that this code was developed completely during COVID. I think we started in 2020 when we were already on lockdown, and it was developed during that period. So, you know, it's an example of the way that things continue to work even though we went physically out to office. So my sincere thanks to all those who were on the committee who contributed and gave of their time and their expertise in developing the code. So I very much look forward to the discussion. I'm on if anyone has any questions, and I really do hope that, you know, all of these actions that we take as we move forward really helps to address those concerns that the sector themselves have brought forward in terms of some of the inconsistencies, as I mentioned, that they've been seeing, both from the practicing and servicing part, but also, you know, there's a lot of concerns that are coming forward now in terms of the type of equipment, the possibility of technology dumping, because as developed countries sort of move away from these equipment, it becomes cheaper because they want to get rid of it, and it ends up here, and then it's, you know, a challenge for us. So, you know, these things are really meant to help the sector in terms of all of us being able to achieve the goals of what we do. So I hope I didn't overspeak my welcome, but thank you very much. And if should you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them. So Kimberly, back over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Gowrie, for that comprehensive overview of the importance of the standard. We have some questions, but we will address them during the Q&A session. I always feel like I learn a lot every time I hear you speak, so thanks for making me feel a little bit smarter today. Our next presentation is an overview of the Draft National Standard, TTS 663, the standard which we are here today to review, done by the Standards Officer responsible for the development, Mr. Kenley Hadai. Mr. Hadai has recently been appointed as the International Regional Standards Coordinator within the Standardization Division. However, he is concluding his standards project under his Standards Officer portfolio. He is a graduate of the University of the West Indies with a major in physics and a minor in material and environmental science. His main focus currently is on governance of organizations, the RAC sector, and LPG. He is committed to the development of standards for improving the overall quality of goods and services in Trinidad and Tobago. Kenley, you can take the floor.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I would like to thank everyone for coming today, as this will be one of the last few closing off standards I would have. So I will be doing the overview of TTS 663, refrigeration and air conditioning sector general requirements. Okay. Right. So this standard was establishes the minimum general requirements for refrigeration and air conditioning sector. This is a national document and is a voluntary standard. Who is responsible for this standard? So this standard was developed by the Specification Committee for Refrigeration and Air Conditioning Systems, chaired by Dr. Mercer Gowrie and Vice Chairperson Mr. Jonathan Bola. So persons from ARIA, ASHRI, CARICOM, Ministry of Education, Youth Training, Ministry of Trade and Industry, Consumer Affairs, Climate Control, Survey, National Training Agency, Ministry of Education, and TTBS persons from the Lab Services Division and Metrology Division. So this is a team that assisted in development of the standard. So the reason for development. So the standard was developed with the overall objective of improving the general quality in the refrigeration and air conditioning sector in Trinidad and Tobago, and to support all organizations, agencies, and individuals responsible for refrigeration and air conditioning system by providing minimum requirements for their operation. The proposed standard is intended to support the national implementation of the Montreal Protocol, and it will support the smooth transition from ozone-depleting substances to ozone and climate-friendly alternatives in refrigeration technology, by allowing existing refrigeration systems to run until end of their useful life, by avoiding premature replacement. This standard also defines minimum requirements for installation, maintenance, and decommissioning decommission of refrigeration and air conditioning systems. Also, this standard serves as a resource document for technicians, training and development of training material. It will also assist for the communication between relevant stakeholders, including service companies for the informal sector. So the contents of this standard. So the first one will be scope, normative reference, terms and definition, general requirements. Redesign a refrigerant system, installation of cooling systems, system operation maintenance, inspection and preventive maintenance, record keeping documentation, recovery, recycling, reclaiming, handling, transportation, and storage of refrigerant, disposal of refrigerant and refrigerant systems, retrofitting and alternatives, safety requirement, training and certification, regulatory framework, and natural and flammable refrigerants. So this standard establishes minimum general requirements for the refrigeration and air conditioning sector. It provides requirements for the following. Redesign, so the same headings I had previously, so redesign, installation, cooling system, record keeping, training, certification, regulatory framework, national flammable refrigerants. So this is the scope of the document, and it covers the following areas. So the normative references, so the International Electrotechnical Commission, IEC. So the standard uses household and similar electrical appliances safety. Part 289. The Trinidad and Tobago standard is TTS 76, Part 20, requirements for labeling, and the UNDP guidebook for implementation of code of good practice, refrigeration sector. So these are the three main normative references used for this standard. So we move on to the terms and definitions now. So these are some of the definitions that were in the standard. Certified cooling system, refrigeration system, toxicity, flammability. One to note would be certified, professionally certified under a professional certification scheme for refrigeration and air conditioning technicians, or certified by a qualified institute or relevant certification bodies. Similarly, for toxicity, the ability of refrigerant to be harmful or lethal due to acute or chronic exposure by contact, inhalation, and ingestion. So these are just some of the definitions we have in the standard, and to provide a little clarity. So as we move on now, general requirements, right? So this section contains requirements for service workshops, personnel and technicians, industry and trade associations, system owners and operators of refrigeration and air conditioning systems, manufacturers and refrigeration and air conditioning systems. Some of the requirements would be service personnel and technicians of refrigeration and air conditioning shall be aware of government policies, ODS phase-out plan, and environmental implication of ODS emissions. Similarly, for industries, industry and trade associations should collect and provide data for decision making and monitoring of ozone monitoring to the National Ozone Unit. Similarly, for system owners and operators of refrigeration and air conditioning systems shall remain aware of government policies, ODS fade-out schedule, and environmental implications of emission of gases. For the manufacturers of refrigeration systems, training and personnel of good practice and environmental management. They covered areas such as those for the general requirements. So as we move on to redesign of refrigerant systems, so this section, redesign of refrigerant systems shall be carried out by persons trained and certified in redesign of refrigerant systems. Designers, manufacturers, and engineers of refrigerant systems shall prioritize refrigerant emission control, REC, when redesigning refrigerant system. Consideration which should be given when redesigning, the person should be professionally skilled, adopt sound environmental practices to eliminate and control refrigerant emission, and assuring safety requirements have been achieved. Some other requirements would be documentation to record and store the required working pressures and temperatures of every component in the refrigeration system, which is associated with respective designs. These are certain guidelines that need to be followed. Okay, so the next one, 6, installation of cooling systems. So when installation of cooling systems being performed by service technicians, consideration should be given to the following. Installing and servicing amounts to a single largest source of ODS emission, and using only technicians and engineers who are trained and professionally certified to service operations. This is an important thing throughout the standard in terms of training and certification, that any task or service and maintenance should be done by professionally certified persons. Also, and to adopt proper installation procedures to avoid damage when installing cooling systems. That could be for when the installing pipes, welding, brazing, similar. System operation and maintenance, 7. Service technicians should consider inspecting the system visually to and during startup, and should also ensure that no signs of leakages, damaged lines or hoses, uncapped valves, or missing or damaged O-rings and other components. This another part of this operation system maintenance would be the commissioning and maintenance. There are other two parts of it that need to be followed as well, and give requirements for both in terms of ensuring the area is clean, monitoring the system to avoid overcharging. Okay. So inspection and preventative maintenance. So when system operation and maintenance are being performed by service technician, consideration to the following: inspect the system visually during startup, ensure, similar to what I just went through. Maintenance, for the maintenance part of it, is to ensure clean area, everything is properly labeled and recorded, and adopt proper maintenance practices, which is critical for any kind of maintenance schedule. For record keeping and documentation, we should always keep and maintain proper, accurate records of refrigerants sold, recovered, recycled, including the type and quality. All refrigerant cylinders should be labeled, and refrigerant system. Ensure that the contents of the weight is easily identifiable. This is critical for identification. So recovery, recycling, and reclaiming, right? So for the principle of this is that training in different methods of recovering refrigerants, because for each refrigerant, they might have a different way of recovering it, removing and recycling and reusing refrigerants as much as practicable to avoid emission into the atmosphere. Ensuring that recycling equipment is intended for the type of refrigerant being processed. Ensuring that any recycling refrigerant is of quality that meets appropriate industry standards and purity. And using the approved recycling machine to recycle refrigerants. Reclaim contaminated refrigerants prior to usage. And this could be done through the chemical process to purify the refrigerant. Handling and transportation. When handling and transportation, consideration should be given to the following: store refrigerants, upright position, and secure them in a well-ventilated area. This is in the event leakages for wide need to be placed in a well-ventilated area. Using closed-loop refrigerant transfer equipment when removing, charging, and storing refrigerants. Using certified containers, and this is an important one, when transferring of reclaimed or recycled refrigerants. Another one would be filling net weight to 80% of the cylinder's internal volume. This one as well, to avoid any overpressuring in the event of the cylinder overfilling, and heat. If it exposed to heat, it might expand and rupture. Okay, so another one would be, so let me go back here. So another thing that we need to consider when handling, transporting, and storing refrigerants is things that should not be done, which would be mixing of refrigerants, as well as venting refrigerants into the atmosphere. I think this is something that we should look at, and these are the requirements that we place to not vent refrigerants into the air. So as we move on now, disposal of refrigerants and refrigerant systems. The activity shall be undertaken. So advise owners of refrigerant systems with major leaks, pipe fractures, compressor breakdowns, or burned out motor, whether or not repair of the system is economically feasible. Record or recovering all refrigerants and oils before decommissioning, dismantling, and disposal. This is to avoid release into the environment. Disposal of contaminated and mixed end-life refrigerants in accordance with the guidelines of the Montreal Protocol by either recovering, recycling, or incineration by approved methods of the type of refrigerant. Another critical item would be to render the cylinders useless by breaking off the valves or piercing the cylinder. This is so the cylinders itself wouldn't be reused for other purposes like storing discarded refrigerants or retrofitting and alternatives. Retrofitting and alternatives shall be considered when replacing of the existing systems is not economical. When retrofitting and alternatives are being performed, the consideration should be given to the expected energy efficiency, performance, and operating cost of the retrofit system, in addition to the direct cost of the retrofitting. Considering retrofitting when major damages exist in the system and requires expensive repair works. Also is that for retrofitting, we should re-identify the new refrigerant as well as label in accordance with the TTS standard, TTS 76. Another two critical items, and this will help for identification after retrofitting is completed. Something that the standard also addresses would be requirement that shouldn't be done, which is altering the natural and flammable refrigerant to use other alternatives of refrigerants. So we don't want to take a flammable refrigerant system and revert it back to a normal system, which using the R12, I think it's 312, yeah. So we don't want to do that. So safety requirements. These should be performed to minimize the safety risks. Reading and following system manufacturer's recommendation for installation requirements. Installing systems in location where it's easily accessible for the ease of serviceability. Also, using pressure relief valves and pressure switches to protect the equipment from exceeding the maximum working pressure. And this is to ensure the burst distance should not exceed the combining of the burst distance and pressure relief valves to prevent any restrictions to the inlet of the relief valve in the event of burst disruption. Training and certification. So all practitioners shall obtain a national refrigeration and air conditioning certificate. When training and certification activities are being performed, awareness of the following activities shall be performed. Awareness of certification requirements for service technicians, and encourage participation in such training and certification schemes. Also, the awareness of certification requirements for recovery, use, and recycling of reclamation equipment, and purchase and use of only certified equipment. Regulatory framework. When regulations are being developed by the competent authority, consideration should be given to requirements concerning transportation, handling, storage, import, and export of refrigerant, refrigerating equipment, recovery and recycling and reclamation equipment, and disposal and destruction of refrigerants. Requirements concerning record keeping and documentation, and procedures for certification of refrigerating equipment, recovery, recycling, and reclaiming equipment, as well as service workshops and technicians. Should also measure the enforcement penalties and fines of withdrawal of operation and service permits in case of non-compliance to the standard requirements concerning the purchase of refrigerants by certified technicians. So these things should be considered when developing a regulatory framework itself. So natural and flammable refrigerants. So for anyone involved, the following shall be considered, knowing that there's a flammable substance being used and what are the characteristics, which is very important. Being aware of the practices for safe handling and storage of flammable refrigerants, introduce procedures and apply design to prevent accidents from flammable substances. This section 17, natural flammable refrigerants, also covers areas such as the use of natural and flammable refrigerants, handling of natural and flammable, service systems containing storage, and servicing tools and equipment. For natural and flammable refrigerants, one of the key areas is to organize and prepare the workplace to avoid potential fire hazards. They must also be trained in using flammable refrigerants. Also, ensure that when using refrigerants that you ensure that there is no release to the environment, as well as in areas where servicing is done using natural and flammable refrigerants, is that there's smoking is not allowed, using and as well as use of open flames. These two requirements are prohibited. Using open flames and smoking in areas that use natural and flammable refrigerants. So as I move on now, that would be the whole of the standard. I move on to the key milestone. So work would have started, as Marissa said, in 2020, but the work on the standard itself now would have started in 2021 in March. And from here now, we would have developed we have used the Trinidad and Tobago refrigerant air conditioning guideline to develop this document. So we went through the market research and prepared the working draft, and the committee would have reviewed it over the 2-year period. So we're in 2023 and we're at the public comment period, which started in February 2023 and would end in April the 5th, 2023. So once we have completed this, we would remove and comments are resolved. This would go for board approval, then to TMC and then board approval, where after which it will be declared a national standard, national voluntary standard. So how would you comment on this standard? So you could either use the website at gottbs.com, or you could email me any comments you have at kenley.hadi@ttbs.org.tt. There's an online form which on the TTBS website where you could add the comments in a table, and when we address it, and we could go through the ease of noticing where the comments are, which line, so it will be easily understood. Public comment period has said the 27th of February to the 5th of May, and this was advertised in the 3 local papers, Newsday, Express, Guardian, and as well as on our social media accounts, and we would have sent out some emails to stakeholders with the draft standard, with the link to the draft standard. So that will be the end of my presentation. I think we will take comments afterwards. So I'll turn you back over to Kimberly.
Thank you, Kenley, for that overview of the draft standard. So moving straight along, we'll now have a presentation on the benefits of the voluntary standard to the RAC sector and best practices from Mr. Maurice McBonnet. I'm sure we all are aware of Mr. McBonnet. He is a trained and certified HVAC professional for the past 28 years. During those years, he engaged in activities in this field as technician, instructor, trainer, consultant, project manager, and examiner for the NEC, and professional certification scheme facilitated by the National Ozone Unit under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Planning and Development. He is presently the assistant manager of the commercial department at Peaks Technologies Limited and a lecturer at ARIA, the Air Conditioning and Refrigeration Industry Association Technical Institute. Mr. McBonnet continues to take vital parts on developments of national guidelines and standards for the RAC industry in Trinidad and Tobago by sharing his knowledge and expertise in the field. Maurice recently joined the distinguished group of international professionals by becoming a certified member of the Refrigeration Service Engineers Society, RSES. Join me in welcoming Mr. McBonnet to present. Maurice?
Thank you very much, Kimberly. And is everyone hearing me?
Confirming, we can hear you and we can see you.
All right, thank you very much. Good afternoon to all, and I must acknowledge the manager, Standardization Division, Ms. Ramshaw, of course, the National Ozone Officer, Dr. Marissa Gurry, and all the other committee members, and everyone who has taken the time out to log in to this session this afternoon. Hearty welcome and good afternoon to all. This afternoon, I'm basically representing the Air Conditioning and Refrigeration Industry Association, that's ARIA, and just want to share a little bit of benefits that we could actually achieve or receive from this standardization. Kenley would have gone through in a nutshell, or he has summarized the entire standardization. And what we have recognized is that if for some reason that we decide to follow, everyone decide to follow this standard, there are so much benefits there for the country, there's so much benefits there for the different companies in the sector, individuals, and on a whole, the consumer out there. So I just want to share a bit of the benefits that we could actually receive from this standardization. But before I go into the benefits, the focal points of this standard gears towards the consumers or users. And this will focus basically on the domestic, commercial, and industrial consumers. We also see where the focal point needs is also for suppliers. The suppliers including manufacturers, importers, distributors. We can't leave out the public or the private sector agencies because they are the ones who actually will conduct education, training, and to a certain level consultations which would be able to guide us into certain areas. The regulatory agencies, TTBS, Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards, Customs and Excise, the Ministry of Trade, and of course, the service providers, whether formal or informal, at different levels from management to trainee or helper. So the focal point basically for this standard will be in these areas, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different areas. The benefits. So as I mentioned, the consumer or user is the key here, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who actually need the service. They are the ones who actually are spending that large amount of money for comfort. So what we have seen coming out of this standard is it protects the consumer or user against danger to health or safety that may derive from high pressure substances, flammable gases and liquids, electrical risk. When we talk about high pressure substances, we're referring to like the refrigerant, flammable gases could either be in a vapor form or liquid form, and electrical shock. In terms of from a public standpoint, protect public and industrial health, welfare, or safety. That has to do with waste substances and waste equipment. How we dispose of our old or unused equipment, where we basically dispose them. We have building comfort and health will protect the end users from sick building syndrome, because it means that we're going to have more quality or quality work coming from our technicians. Protection of the environment. We heard a lot from Dr. Gori in terms of ozone depleting substances and global warming substances. So it protects the environment in the use of ozone depleting substances, global warming substances, and also in terms of disposal of some of the used equipment. It ensures acceptable quality in products, whether produced for home use or for export to different parts of the world, whether through regional. In any case where there is restriction in choice of source of supply, all that will ensure acceptable quality once we follow the standards. Adequate information will be given to the consumer or user. Users can have the opportunity to make better choices. Having knowledge and understanding about the standards that are out into the public, they were able to have a better understanding so that they could actually have that opportunity to make the right choices at the right time. It prevents fraud and misrepresentation. Many times we have misleading advertising or labeling. So such can be recognized before contractual agreements are made. These standards coming out of it will define minimum requirements for installations, maintenance, decommissioning of refrigeration and air conditioning system. What does this mean is that when we talk about minimum requirements, we're going to have quality technicians, quality work. In other words, consumers or the whole are going to benefit a lot from the type of work that are being put out or given from our industry. Why? Because our guys will be trained, our guys will be prepared to actually handle this. We heard about the professional certification and so on. So it means that there will be certain sort of requirement to carry out these sort of work. Out of this standard, technicians can use it as a resource document for training. So they could actually turn to it for valid information, technical institutions can use it for development of training materials. It helps to initiate communication between relevant stakeholders, service guys, with the main focus to the informal sector. Also, it helps to ensure smooth transition from ozone-depleting substances and climate-friendly alternatives in refrigeration technology by allowing refrigeration systems to run until the end of their useful life without the premature replacement. You would have heard Dr. Gori mention time and time again in terms of once the refrigerant is in the system, it causes no problem or no harm to our environment. So with proper maintenance, proper refrigeration practices, the refrigerant is actually safe inside the system. So it will assist even, this standard will assist even in the smooth transition from these ozone depleting substances, climate, global warming gases, and the transition will be done smoothly in terms of having those that doesn't contribute to our ozone depletion, all right? And we also to be able to use more energy efficiency equipment along with those greenhouse gases that will be more favorable. Coming out of those standards, we have those benefits. And what we have recognized is that at the end of it all, we're gonna have good practices in the industry once we all follow those standards. We're gonna have handling and storage of pressurized equipment and vessels. We're gonna follow such like signage. We're gonna have, in terms of how we store these pressurized refrigerants or pressurized substances at a certain temperature, we need to follow the necessary temperature guidelines so that these systems or even the cylinders will not be exposed to temperatures above normal. Ventilations, we will basically look at ventilation, how we store these gases. Transportation of these gases, Kennedy went through it, and he gave us a whole guideline in terms of how these should be done. Good practices will have comply with equipment manufacturers' user manual guidelines. So once we comply with equipment manufacturers' user manual guidelines, we're gonna have better installations, better commissioning of the equipment, meaning that the equipment is gonna work in terms of how it's supposed to, less breakdown. We have replacement parts. Once we follow the manufacturer's guidance, not to replace parts with substitute, all right? Once we have correct application of the equipment, correct application of the parts, correct application of the refrigerant, all those are basically comply with manufacturer's user manual guides. Those are basically good practices in the industry. Always consider working area during installation, repair, and maintenance as temporary high-risk zones. So whenever we actually outside on a job site, we need to take into consideration job analysis, meaning that we basically take consider the risks that involve around. We must take into consideration in terms of using the correct PPE, and I stress correct PPE, using the correct tools and equipment to carry out the job. Why? Because we are going to take every job as, or every area as a temporary high-risk zone. So we're basically gonna protect that area. When we do that, such protection, we're covering ourselves, we're covering the client, we're covering those who passing by, the equipment, and others. It also covers safe handling of the refrigerants. We heard a lot from Kennedy concerning recovery how we recover the refrigerants and recovering in the correct procedure, following the correct guidelines for recovery. At the end of the day, we're trying to avoid venting the refrigerant, charging, using the correct procedures to charge, whether it's through using our scales to measure the refrigerant in, whether it's through superheat or using our saturation table. Labeling is important. At the end of it all, we label in terms of what type of equipment, what type of refrigerant, the time the job was done, and also safe handling of refrigerant covers disposal. How would we dispose our equipment at the end use, and even in terms of the refrigerant cylinders and so on. We heard about brazing and soldering and other methods of refrigerant lines connection. It must be done properly, efficiently. It must follow up with proper tests and leak detection methods according to industry standards to avoid frequent breakdowns, to avoid leakage of refrigerant into the atmosphere. Then we have operational checks. The operational checks will include records of service so that we could actually have when was the last time the equipment was serviced, the due date for servicing. We also need to have such like temperature of supply and return air. That's for air conditioning. For refrigeration itself, we might want to check like pull down time. All those are very important. The compressor current itself, that is being drawn because we're looking at energy efficiency, even in good practices. Including the Air Conditioning and Refrigeration Industry Association area, wishes and hopes that this document with all its technical specifications and other precise criteria design be used consistently as a rule, guideline, or definition. It will enable us as a country to compete on equal terms, that certain quality is attained, and at the same time ensure that a high level of safety is achieved in this industry. So once we basically adhere to the standards, there are the benefits, and out of the benefits, we're gonna have good refrigeration practice being done, and at the end of the day, we will all able to see the result of it. So by this time, I wanna thank you for listening and close here, and hope that if there's any question, you will actually ask during the question and answer period. Turn you over to Kimberly.
Thank you, Maurice, for that enlightening presentation on the benefits of using the standard. Now I have an idea of what to look for when the techs are servicing all my appliances. So this brings us to our question and answer session, our anxiously awaited question and answer session. And we have a few questions already in the chat, so we will address those first. But please feel free, if you have a question, to raise your hand or type it in the chat, and our knowledgeable presenters will address them. So the first question I'm seeing in the chat is from Daikin for Dr. Gowrie. Taking advantage that you are here, has Trinidad and Tobago already published the quota for HFCs, or is it expected in the second half of the year? Thank you in advance. Dr. Gowrie, can you answer this question, please?
Thanks, Kimberly, and thank you very much for the question. So at the moment, as I mentioned, we are currently doing our baseline survey. The quotas would really be divvied dependent on what our baseline looks like and who our historical importers over that 3-year period, 2020, 21, 22. So the short answer to your question is that we will be probably looking into that in the second half of this year, once we have our baseline and that information properly collected and collated. So we'll be getting back to the stakeholders within the second half of this year to let them know what that is about.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Gowrie. So I think the second question is also for you, so you could probably stay there. We have another question from Daikin. From which GWP is considered high?
All right, so at the moment, we are putting together what our quota system is going to look like nationally. At the moment, we are looking at what some of the other countries have been using as their high GWP sort of gauge. We are looking at around 700 and above as high, but we would really be sort of coming back to folks again within the second half of this year to really, once we sort of get a gauge of what gases we have in the sector and what we really have in terms of the national landscape, and then we'll be moving forward to see how we can divvy up in terms of high and low GWP.
Okay, thank you very much again. So the next question I'm seeing is from Mr. Alejandro Garcia. Are there any plans to make this standard mandatory in the future? So for this one, I'd like to turn you over to Ms. Nadita Ramachala. Nadita, are you there?
Hi, good day. So this particular standard is written as a voluntary code. So it provides best practices. Now, I wanted to highlight the difference between the electrical wiring code, which is also a voluntary standard, but enforced by the Electrical Inspectorate Division. The GEI, as we call them, they have their empowering legislation, which allows them to use the electrical wiring code on a mandatory basis. So they're empowered to do two things. They can assess the safety of electrical installations and grant a license, and they also grant licenses to wiremen. In this particular instance, we would have to work out the regulatory framework for this code and determine the feasibility of which regulators can assess certain components. So in terms of TTBS, we are not empowered at this time to fully enforce this type of code. So while we have the powers to establish a compulsory standard, our main focus would be on goods, so tangible products. So there may be other standards that we can make compulsory using our existing legislation, which is the Standards Act. So for example, the energy efficiency labeling for refrigeration appliances, that is one standard that will be upgraded to compulsory status. And the second one that we are looking at is the energy efficiency labeling, or what we call MEPS for short, for air conditioners. So that work is in progress. At this time, our mandatory work really focuses on products. So for this code, or parts of the code to be made mandatory, we would have to look at where the regulatory responsibility resides. So there may be some parts that relate to health and safety, and our key regulator there would be OSHA, so the OSHA authority/agency. There may be some components that could possibly reside under the electrical safety issue. So it is a bit complicated in terms of how we'd have to establish the regulatory scheme at a future point, but it's something that we have taken note of, and we would have to look very carefully at where the regulatory powers would reside and which particular agency has the mandate. So we are not taking off the compulsory nature of this, but it's something that as a country we would have to examine very carefully.
Thank you, Nadita. I hope that answers your question, Mr. Garcia. So the next question I'm seeing is from Martha Narrett. Do we have to specify the composition of the refrigerant, for example, R410E? So this question could either be for Kenley or Marissa. Marissa, would you like to take the floor?
Sure. So the question, if I understand correctly, this would be in terms of the composition of the refrigerant in the cylinder when it's being imported, yes?
Yes, I believe.
Yeah. So that, yes, in terms of what the content of the cylinder has in it, it would need to be in accordance with the refrigerant cylinder labeling standard. So once the standard specifies certain things that you would need to have as information, then yes, it would have to essentially say what's in the cylinder. Back many years ago, we were having issues where, with respect to blends, etc., we were getting some strange things in cylinders coming into the country, and that was the impetus for that standard being crafted to start with. TTBS would have done their market survey and seen that the concerns of the sector were in fact valid. So in terms of as much information as possible that can be required to give would be suitable. As I have the floor, Kimberly, if you allow me, in terms of the response that I had given to the previous question, in terms of the high and low GWP, I just wanted to indicate, I don't know if I said it in my presentation, but as a country, we and a region, I should say, we are moving towards the lowest GWP possible, and that's where we would want to transition our market. Of course, as a small island developing state, climate change is certainly of a concern to us and our region. So in terms of the refrigerant that we are looking to long-term would be things such as natural refrigerant, CO2, hydrocarbon, and those sorts of things where the GWP is, as you know, very low. So even though in terms of our quota system, and what the quota system may look like in terms of high and low GWP, in terms of our market transition and where we'd want to go with respect to looking at which equipment we'd want to have on our markets, etc., it would be towards those lowest GWP refrigerant that we can, you know, once the equipment is available and compatible to our country, etc. So as I mentioned, things like natural refrigerants, CO2, the HFOs, you know, those are the ones that they're using in the vehicles at the moment. And those are the things that we want to encourage. So I just wanted to mention that as I have the floor. I hope that answered the question for the composition one.
Thank you, Marissa. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. Does anyone have any questions? Please feel free to raise your hand. Okay, I'm seeing one coming in from Mr. Stanley Tempro. On the matter of responsibility, I note that in Kenley's presentation, he indicated that the responsibility for monitoring would be in the hands of the industry associations, but is it not normal practice that the owner of the standard is responsible for monitoring?
I will take this one, Kimberly. Yeah. So in terms of the voluntary standard, the first responsibility will be the person who has a responsibility for the operations. But there are some industry associations, in order to participate within the industry, you have to comply with the best practice. So for example, we have associations for professional engineers, we have the Board of Engineering, we have other professional associations where as an association, they have agreed among themselves as to what standards they would be used. So this is one way that a voluntary standard like this can be used by an industry association that would like to improve the quality of the service. And in that way, in order to be part of the association, the standard could become a prerequisite for participating as part of the association. So that is something that, say, ARIA could look at as a future opportunity to ensure a quality of service across industry associations. So I would just like to highlight, you know, in terms of levels of standardization, that would be industry standardization, and they could use our national standard that we are discussing here today to set some benchmarks for the practices within their memberships.
Thank you, Dadita, and thank you all very much for your questions thus far. If there are any more questions, you could please feel free to raise your hand or type it in the chat. Not seeing anything. Okay. Sure. Ms. Narat, you can go ahead.
Yes, I don't think I was clear about the composition of the refrigerant. My question was more related to, do we need to place a label on the products, on the carton boxes, of the composition of the refrigerant? For example, R410A, the composition of R410A is 50% R32 and 50% R125. Do we need to have such a label such as like that, you know, putting the composition of the refrigerant on the carton box, in the product and outer box?
So I believe I could probably take this question. I think the refrigerant containers labeling standard says that it has to be on the container, the refrigerant container, the composition with respect to blends. So once it's a blend, it has to be stated on the label so that we can verify.
What label?
On the labeling, the container, the refrigerant container label.
Container?
Okay, are you speaking about refrigerants used in appliances or on the containers?
Yeah, okay. For example, air conditioner, mini splits, for example. We do specify, let's say, what kind of refrigerant the appliance has on the carton box, like for example, R410A or R32 on the outer box. But do we have to place an additional label containing the composition of, let's say, R410A?
Okay, so that would be under the electrical appliances standard, which currently states that once it's a blend, it should be stated on the appliance label. So if R410A is considered a blend, then it would have to have the components stated on the label of the appliance. So because we have a refrigerant clause in our labeling of electrical appliances standard, which states that once it's a blend, it has the composition has to be stated. Maurice, you could probably confirm here, would R410A be considered a blend, or would it be more of the newer versions, or is R410A considered a blend?
It is a blend.
Okay, so then once it's a blend, usually that's what we want. We want the composition of the blend stated.
Where can we get, like, for example, a sample of that specific label, the measurements and how the label needs to be placed on the packaging?
Okay, well, you can look at the TTS 76 Part 30, which is the labeling of electrical appliances specification. However, I don't believe that there are actual examples of the labels. It just has the requirements that needs to be on the label. I would say that that standard is currently being revised, and we are working on that revision being posted probably by the end of the year, which would be TTCS 24. I believe we would have had the consultation last year, and they would have had the similar public comment consultation. But if you want, you can always email TTBS, I'll put my email in the chat, and you could send us, and we could always dialogue on this further, because that would be involving the implementation division as to what they currently accept, because they are the ones who enforce our compulsory standards.
And Kimberly, just to jump in here, the main product standard that we use for refrigerators and appliances, as well as air conditioners, for electrical safety would be the UL and the IEC standards. So what would normally be done in terms of those particular products, the implementation division is responsible for the enforcement of the product standards, and they would normally work with the importers and manufacturers on a case-by-case basis if there is a different standard that the product complies with. So approvals would normally be granted on the assessment of the label. So the standards themselves do not provide prescriptive requirements for the label. You would have to provide the documentation to the implementation division, and they would review and assess.
Thank you, Nadita. I see a question from Vishal Gulcharan. Go ahead, Mr. Gulcharan.
Hello, hi.
Hi.
Okay, my question is, how is the quota system going to be developed what is the formula going to be used for the quota system going to be implemented in January 2024 for the HFCs? Who in terms of the amount to be imported per importer, the license basically? What is the formula? How are you going to develop that, or what is the how are you going to arrive at that formula?
Dr. Gauri, take it away.
Sure. Thanks for the question. So basically, it would be the same methodology that we would have used for the CFCs and the HCFCs. And how we would have done that in the past is that each importer, we would have looked at your historical imports. So for CFCs, we would have used this is a model, the years is determined by the Montreal Protocol. So for CFCs, it was 5 years prior. For HCFCs, it was 2 years, 2009, 2010. For this one, it's 3 years, 2020, 21, 22. And basically how our baseline is established is that it is the sum of however much the importers would have imported. The average of those 3 years for each importer, and then the sum of that is what our national baseline is made up of. And then how it was done in the past is that depending on how much as an importer you would have contributed to the baseline is how much you would have been apportioned as your quota moving forward. So a similar methodology will be used. The difference is that this time around, because there are high and low GWP gases that are still being considered for some applications in terms of equipment, we don't have firm technology going forward. So for some there are. So in refrigeration, for example, R600A is tried and true technology. It's on the market. It is widely available, etc. R290, similarly in refrigeration, is available and on the market. So for that one, we have the technology. For the air conditioning units, for some of the mini splits, we do have the 12,000 BTU inverters that are using R290 that's available for our market. We have word from some of the international manufacturers that they are doing the 18,000 and 24,000 BTU sizes that should be available for R290 later this year. For some of our more commercial type chillers, etc., there's certain refrigerant that we're looking toward so that it's not as clear cut as the CFC and HCFC, where we were saying we're not using 12 anymore, we are using X, or we're not using 22 anymore, we're using 13A and 410A. But this rounds, the high GWPs, which would be the 134A, the 410A, the 44A, and those, etc. Those are the ones we are targeting specifically first. We as a country and a region are trying to move away from the HFC. So R32 is also something we are trying to move away from. But of course, we are cognizant of the fact that for some of those applications that use R32, there's still development happening with the alternative technologies. But to answer your question in terms of how the quotas are going to be decided, it's the same methodology we would have used the last 2 times, which has worked well for the country and kept us in compliance. Again, amalgamation of those 3 years, and then according to how much that particular company would have contributed to the baseline. And then we will come back to the sector in the latter half, pretty soon, to describe in terms of how that quota system is going to be divvied out. And how companies would then have to apply for certain gases. At the moment,
Why I'm asking this question is because 2020, 21, and 22 were anomaly years. It weren't like the past. It was years of COVID, right? So therefore, I would think that in terms of the ability to the importers to really import what they could have imported would have been different in the past. Because
that is something that I thought was the case, and I was making the case for that internationally. However, our import data does not corroborate with that. Our imports actually increased over those 3 years somehow. In 2020, 21, and 22, it's very high. So because there are some countries where the imports dipped, but for our country it didn't. So we couldn't argue that case because we actually had to go against factual data. And because all these gases, you need to get an import license, and that's what we report against internationally. The data was showing
all
that
the importers, so were there, well, I haven't seen the data in terms of the statistics of who imported and how much, but you're saying that the importers imported more during these years than previous years?
The licenses that they would have applied for, yeah.
Wow,
yeah, we didn't face, there were some countries where this seemed to have happened. There were some countries that it didn't affect, and there were some countries that it dipped. because the moisture protector has been looking at this for the last 2 years, because as you're saying, this was a concern that a lot of people, including myself, had, and we didn't want to have a false baseline. But I was very happy that that's not the case for us.
Well, I would love to see that data. Additionally, why I was alluding to that point, because the cost of shipping increased 600 and 700 times in the last 2 years. So I'm wondering how the imports increased during that time, and because based on my experience that there was a significant shortage of refrigerant throughout and major times, and there were quite a number of times where there were monopolies and duopolies of who had refrigerant and who didn't. So I would love to see the data statistics for Trinidad.
We would have presented that. I didn't present those slides today because the focus was more on the code, but we would have presented that data on the 16th of March. But if you, I could probably put my email in the chat and I could share the information with you. But we did see an increase in the amount, so that, and remember we were looking at, so we have data that goes all the way back to way back. So since 2015, we've been looking at data going up the road. So even though there may have been strange things going on with the quantities, we are very aware of who's been bringing in and the amounts. And what we saw sometimes too is that even though the actual refrigerant may have come in spaced out during the year, we were seeing like large shipments. As you're saying, shipping was an issue. So some people brought in a large amount at one part as opposed to continuously during the year. But in terms of total quantities, we didn't go down as a country. So I'll put my email in the chat.
No problem, Ms. Gordon. Would the quota system be developed based on the cylinders that were imported, or the amount of equipment that contained refrigerant imported, or both?
The quota system is for gas, so it's on the refrigerant.
Okay. Okay, understand. But just to make it a little interesting, is there any chance that based on because I'm a new importer, right? 2020, 21, and 22, right? And that's why I'm asking that.
Well, if you imported in those years, then you would be part of the quota, because you're therefore considered historical, quote unquote, because you might have been new, but you still make up that baseline.
All right, and there's no chance that you'll be looking at 2023 on for this year.
No, because that's not part of our baseline. Would not include 2023's amount. That's the mandate we have as a country, is those 3 years.
All right, then.
But you can reach out to me and we can continue the discussion.
Okay, doctor. Thank you. You can leave an email there.
No problem.
Okay, bye.
Thank you, Marissa. Thank you, Mr. Gulcharan. Dr. Gauri also posted her email in the chat, so you can go ahead and continue your dialogue with her. Does anybody else have a question? I'm not seeing anything new in the chat and no new hands. Going once, going twice. Okay, so the question and answer session is officially closed, and I would move on to our last section, which is our closing remarks. So today we have our newly minted executive director, Mr. Jose Trejo. So Mr. Trejo is a Belizean national. He has spent the last 22 years as a public officer serving the people of Belize. Prior to joining the service, he worked at the Central Bank of Belize as an economist, having direct responsibility for the compilation of Belize balance of payment statistics. An economist by training, he holds a Master's of Arts in International Affairs with a concentration in development economics. And eager to share his knowledge and mentor young professionals in academia, he has served in the capacity as an adjunct professor in economics at the UE School of Continuing Studies, Belize, the University of Belize, and Galen University. Throughout his career, he has worked with several government ministries, including the Ministry of National Resources and Environment, Trade, Commerce and Industry, Finance, Economic Development, and most recently, Agriculture, Food Security, and Enterprise. During the period of 2015 to 2017, he served as the chairman and coordinator of CARICOM, Regional Organization for Standards and Quality, headquartered in Barbados, and the sub-regional Central American KMET group of the Inter-American Metrology System, respectively. Mr. Trejo previously served as the director of Belize Bureau of Standards during the periods of 2007 to 2023. Please allow me to welcome Mr. Trejo to provide some closing remarks. Mr. Trejo?
Thank you, Kimberly, for that gracious introduction. Dr. Marisa Gori, Mr. Mark Barnett, Specification Committee members, participants, ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant good afternoon. On behalf of the TTBS Board of Directors and the TTBS management team, I would like to thank everyone for taking the time to participate in the stakeholder consultation on this very important draft standard for the refrigeration and air conditioning sector. This is one of the key projects under the National Standardization Strategy and part of the ongoing collaboration with the National Ozone Unit, Ministry of Planning and Development. A special thanks to our presenters, Dr. Gori, Mr. McBarnett, and Mr. Hadai, as well as our moderator, Ms. Badlu. I would like to urge all participants to actively review and provide feedback, as stakeholder input is a key component of good standardization practices. As the Executive Director of TTBS, and as Ms. Badlu said, freshly minted, this is my 7th week here at the helm of the TTBS. I am heartened to see the level of participation and engagement on this draft standard. We will be increasing our stakeholder engagement activities over the course of this year, and we look forward to your continued support of our standardization activities. This is a main thrust under the implementation of the National Quality Policy. We have recently launched a National Quality Award, and I am encouraging everyone to submit applications. We are keenly addressing the matter of creating not just a standards-conscious society, but a quality-conscious society through the National Quality Policy. I would like to thank the members of the Specification Committee for their hard work. The Specification Committee is very diverse, as you can tell, and many of the key interests are represented here. But it is critical that we engage all levels of the RAC industry. And with this in mind, I thank you for your time and feedback. In addition, I would like to thank the standardization team, Kenley, Kimberly, and Nadita for putting this engagement session together. Finally, thanks to each and every one of you for attending today's stakeholders consultation and providing meaningful feedback, which the standardization team will address. We appreciate your commitment to the standards development process and look forward to your continued support. A pleasant good evening and thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Mr. Trejo. And I'll now switch you over to Nadita. I think she wants to also give her personal thanks.
So I'd like to thank Mr. Trejo for giving us the closing remarks. We organized this consultation in a very quick fashion. We wanted to ensure that we had some feedback, and we will continue to liaise with stakeholders to get more direct feedback. In terms of the points being raised earlier, we encourage persons to look at our standards database, which is available on gottbs.com. We have a number of product standards that cover refrigerators as well as air conditioners, as Kimberly would have indicated before. We also have the labeling of refrigerant containers, and that will aid in understanding what are the labeling requirements for the product-specific items. With regard to the refrigeration code, we encourage you to submit any comments. We know that Marissa and her team have done a lot of work and already provided national guidelines. And what we are doing is transforming those guidelines into requirements which can be used to support regulatory frameworks across the regulators in Trinidad and Tobago. So I encourage everyone to review and use our online commenting form. If you need any further information, Kimberly has responsibility for some of the projects. So for example, energy efficiency labeling And I'd like to thank Marissa for championing the implementation of, the Montreal Protocol locally, internationally, regionally. She has really been a strong collaborator with the TTBS, and this is an excellent demonstration of how standards support policy implementation, international agreements, as well as regulatory systems in the country. So this is a model that we are promoting across the board. I'd also like to thank Maurice. He has been one of the technical experts that has been very active, and also Kimberly for her moderating. I will leave Kenley for last. So this is Kenley's last standards project. And what he did not indicate is that he recently took up the role of international regional standards coordinator. So you will probably be engaging with him in a different capacity as we strengthen our involvement in the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, as well as our regional work at CrossSkew. So thank you, everyone, and we will be in contact regarding this particular standard. Feel free to reach out to the standardization team and, of course, Marissa and her team. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadita. So on behalf of everyone here, with all of the team, I'd like to thank everyone here for coming. Thank you